Right, good afternoon. A word of welcome to everyone on this last event of SIGLA. I will very soon hand over to Dr. Michelle Nell, who will do the opening and run it from there. I hope everybody just kept track of the house rules, most important, of course, being that please, those that do not participate as speakers, that you keep your video and your mic off. The event is being recorded, and I want to hand over to Michelle Nell now, and I want to ask that everybody just make sure that your video is off. There's somebody with a big red flash on the video, so if you can just please switch off your video. Thank you. Michelle, over to you.
Thanks, Professor Frey. Good afternoon, colleagues. Very welcome to this webinar on influencing military futures. Allow me to first of all welcome the audience that's participating with us today, because without you, we will actually just be speaking to ourselves. So this particular webinar on military futures, of course, is done in collaboration with the Institute for Futures Research. This is, as Professor Frey has mentioned, our last webinar for SIGLA this year. It's been a very busy year for us in spite of the COVID restrictions. And I think it's been mentioned previously at other venues that, you know, the positive thing about the whole COVID situation that we've been under is that the webinar platform allowed us to reach much more people than we normally would have, and from various locations being able to participate and to interact. So very welcome to the audience. Also want to give a special word of welcome to the participants and the speakers. We have a number of eminent speakers today, and they will be introduced as we progress through the program. And I, for one, am really looking forward to the conversation that we will be having this afternoon. As mentioned by Professor Frey, I just want you to take note of the house rules that was up from earlier. That has been highlighted, but please feel free to pose all comments and questions that you do have on the chat function. I will be monitoring that and facilitating the questions from there on. And this brings me then to the very nice job I have of introducing our first speaker, who is Dr. Morne Mostert. It's really my honor to do so. I've had the opportunity to attend quite a number of seminars and workshops where Dr. Mostert was the speaker, and it's always been informative, it's been entertaining, and he's really an excellent speaker. So Professor Mostert is the director of the Institute of Futures Research at Stellenbosch University, where he established the research unit for African futures. And you are more than welcome to read through his very impressive bio that is attached to the program. So yeah, with those few words, Dr. Mostert, the floor is yours.
Dr. Nell, thank you so much, Professor Frey, and to SIGLA colleagues, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. It's a tremendous privilege for me to share just a few thoughts this afternoon on the nature of investigating the future. Now, our theme for this afternoon is influencing military futures. And as a futurist, I have to say, of course, in our view, there's only one thing that you can influence, and that's the future. So I'll talk a little bit about the dominant paradigm, the thinking, the approach, the philosophy behind futures thinking in just a few thoughts before we get into the nitty-gritty on the military futures themselves. And so allow me to share just a few thoughts then, if I can stop sharing for a moment, and there we are. My thoughts for the afternoon then focused mainly on the very notion of strategic foresight, what we mean by futures thinking as we consider options for alternative futures. And the reason that's so important is because we may very well feel that the current future is not presenting us with the level of attractiveness that we'd like. So our future is of course what you might call a meta science. It is a science of sciences, a transdisciplinary science, and we certainly do not claim to have knowledge of the future in the traditional scientific way, but it is important to say that this is really about learning about multiple futures by learning about the future. In other words, our fundamental and first understanding is that more than one future is always possible. They don't all operate at the same level of probability, and therefore it's important to consider what those other futures might look like. Perhaps the most fascinating idea to me about investigating the future is that when you look at the future that you look at changes. And when you don't look at the future, and here's something really very important from a military competitiveness perspective, when you don't look at the future, what happens to you is that you end up in the future that your competitor has designed, something that the military, of course, can ill afford. Now, if you're curious about the constructs behind this idea, here's just one example of a study. This is in the commercial world, a European study, a longitudinal study that finds what you'd expect it to find, that companies that look at the future consistently outperform organizations that don't look at the future. Now, you may argue, well, of course, everybody's looking at the future. Our experience, my own experience in working in 11 or 12 African countries, in much of Europe and Rome and Paris and London and Geneva and a great deal of the Middle East, is that people have an aspiration for the future, but very seldom do they investigate the realities that the future may present. So what we're often trying to do with institutions is to get them to move away from a traditional as-is-to-be approach to strategy. Here we are today in the noisy mess of the present. Here's where we'd like to be. And what we're trying to guide them towards is an appreciation of multiple futures. Why is that so important? Because, as we can already see, the present hasn't necessarily worked according to our strategic plan. Therefore, more than one future must be investigated. This, I think, illustrates the difficulty for senior decision makers in futures thinking. If you think about this as a kind of temporal domain of the past, the present, and the future, then of course, in reality, a decision can only ever be made in the present. What's the problem with that? The present is noisy, it's messy. There are politicians with opinions, things are in the media. The world is in flux. But you can make it in no other time. Even if you make it tomorrow it will be the present. So that messes with our ability as senior people to make decisions. So we could ask, well, what do you make the decision based upon? And of course, for most of us, the answer is quite simply the past. But here's the real kicker. What are you making that decision for? And you can only ever make it for one thing, of course, and that's the future. So you can see why futures thinking is such a complex thing to do. Make it in the present with all the noise, base it on the past, a time you will never visit again, and make it for the future, a time you've never visited before. Well, then a lot of people say to us, the thing to do is go back to basics. That's the answer. Well, the past, of course, plays a role. But we have a deep suspicion as future scientists about whether such a thing as basics that arrive from a time that you will never visit again may in fact be the exact same set of principles that will save us in a time we've never visited before. So we do look at the past to a certain degree, but, and I'll say a word or two about that in a moment, we are predominantly concerned, of course, as futurists with the future. No surprises there. As futurists, we have many faults, but living in the past isn't one of them. We're curious about everything that hasn't happened yet, particularly what could happen and what, in our humble view, should happen. Now, the reality is when we think about what could happen, what we call explorative futures, the simple scientific futures truth is that more than one future is always possible. It is always possible. This is simultaneously daunting and exciting because it means that we are not doomed for one certain future, provided we make alternative decisions for alternative futures. So more than one explorative future is always possible. But of course, we're not only interested in what could happen, we have a view. Militaries all around the world have a view, as do their nations. They're interested in the future they want, so-called normative futures. And you can think about that in a few ways. One way is to say, well, depending on which explorative future plays out, you may want different things. So that already supports the idea that if you accept the thesis that more than one future is possible, that might mean that you might want more than one different thing. It's also possible you could say, well, I don't value those explorative futures at the same level. I prefer one of them. I have a preferred explorative normative future. And what that means is that you can only identify that once you've looked at what some of those other futures might mean. It's also possible, of course, that a future may emerge that looks nothing like the way the future used to look. In other words, the future is not what it used to be. Of course, the past is important, and we do recognize an investigation of the past, particularly on a little framework we call the OPACH framework, which says, yes, let us acknowledge the origins of militaries here in South Africa and sub-Saharan Africa and the rest of Africa and the world. Let us understand where militaries come from. Let us admit to their patterns, their typical behaviors. Let us acknowledge that militaries have attitudes and societies have attitudes towards those militaries. Militaries have traditions, in many cases steeped in tradition. Some of those should be celebrated. Some of them come from a time that we really never will visit again. Militaries and societies have habits, unthinking behavior, things we do because we do them, unconsidered, uncontested. And militaries, like all societies in which they operate, have cultures. That is, traditional behaviors, patterns of behaviors, and you can see how these OPACH dimensions all overlap. And there are, of course, ethnic culture dimensions there, but I'm particularly curious here about institutional culture. And you'll hear a fascinating presentation about the past in just a moment, as it considers origins, patterns, attitudes, traditions, habits, and culture. Some of you will have seen this little research brief that I was invited to produce by SIGLA, and I'm very grateful for that. And in that brief, I looked at just a very simplistic view of identifying multiple futures, just as an example of how undeniable multiple futures may be. And very, very simply, I argued in that piece, if we look at two major drivers of military futures, simply in terms of global security and budgetary agility response, that is the level of budgetary agility with which a country responds in its military, we can see at least 4 scenarios emerging there, each telling a very different tale of what the future will demand of us. Multiple futures, therefore, is no longer optional in a world governed by hyper complexity. I'll suggest to you then that unless multiple futures are in fact explored, many strategy sessions, and I spend much of my life in them, is essentially an intellectual exercise governed by last year plus 8% minus a few percentage points on cost. And that, I submit to you, dear colleagues, is not terribly strategic. It is simply fundamentalist incrementalism, which does not respond to the complex demands of the hypercomplexity in which we find ourselves. Of course, we can think about this purely in terms of how we manage resources and the methods we engage as we exert the capabilities of our militaries. But I would argue that's a present-oriented approach. The reality is that we have, of course, a series of mental models that govern in the first place the kind of decisions we make in terms of resources, financial, human, and technological, and the kind of methodologies we favor. And it is that which I argue predominantly will determine the kind of results that we will produce. Mental models, of course, color all these various aspects. It's worth just saying a word or two about the nature of mental models as they shape our thinking, which in turn shapes our decisions, and that produces our futures. Mental models, we should emphasize, are not the world. Mental models are a representation of the world. It is an attempt at sense-making. These are lenses we use for understanding. And very importantly, if these mental models are left unchallenged for too long, bizarrely, the mental model becomes, for so many of us, the world itself. In the same way, the lenses we use to interrogate the future become the future we interrogate. Our mental models, therefore, have shaped our present and should be interrogated for the impact they will have on shaping our future. The consequences of ignoring these are fundamentally critical to our futures. They are essentially the difference between seeing that and seeing that. The difference is staggering. In the first option, we may well be driven by courage, confidence, and optimism, but blind to the context, the risk is staggering. An exposition of the context, an examination of our mental models shows the opportunities for the agility so desperately needed in so many military environments all around the world. Let me close on evaluating the extent to which militaries may examine the future as they design their own processes, policies, procedures, finances, talent, and other resources. There is a level at which there is very little design happening at all, and in fact is simply last year, or in fact the last 10 years plus 8%. It's design-free history. It's riddled with memory, with selective recall, and dominated by hindsight. There's a level above that, which is based essentially on commentary of the noise of the day, and equally is design-free. And at a third level there is some anticipatory work, but mainly based on wishful, blind spot riddled prediction. A level beyond that is, as we see in many regimes around the world, design of the military against the future and even against its citizenry, inherently oppositional. A level beyond that is design despite the future, a recognition that the future may exist, but a willful, false confidence design despite what the future may be telling us. In a more considered approach to the future, as I continue my sharing, let me not interrupt myself as I've just done there. If you'll allow me to just go back there for a moment. In a more considered view, there is a design for the future, a recognition that the future exists, but nevertheless a dualistic relationship with the future, separate from the future. Increasingly, leading organizations are considering an approach of design with the future, in which there is an acceptability and an acceptance of the reality of the future. For some reason, colleagues, my sharing keeps disappearing. A design with the future, walking hand in hand with the future. We may even advance to a level of being designed by the future, with an intimate appreciation of the future and the wisdom it offers us today. Of course, if you are intimately powerful, intimately wealthy, and intimately charismatic, you may in fact be able to design the future, an empowered decision-making approach that is active and agile in its co-design approach. It was Churchill, a man of war and military himself, who said the empires of the future are the empires of the mind. It's those minds that we as futurists are curious about, and I'm most curious to learn from the other great minds on our session here this afternoon. Thank you, Dr. Nell, Professor Frey.
Dr. Mostert, thank you so much. Yeah, you actually cut your time off by a few minutes. It's been Yeah, we also, I don't see at this stage any comments or questions from our audience. So I have a question. I don't know whether it is a fair question to ask. I'm just, for me, trying to get it, because I'm much more of a think practical in it rather than in abstract terms. But you've spoken about steeped in tradition, habits, cultures, and for me, in my mind, this creates very predictable patterns. And the nature of the military being one of a democracy, they much more look at what is the current situation. We are much more reactionary than anticipatory in what we do. And in my mind, that tends to make this whole bureaucracy bogged down in their current thinking and the way in past thinking. So how would you suggest one approaches a democracy such as this, with these slow turning wheels and cultures and everything, to really start looking at alternative futures? Because I can see the importance of that, but how do we go about approaching this bureaucracy and getting them there to think about this?
Well, it's really fascinating, because of course there is also wisdom in reacting. And the reason for that is you couldn't, of course, predict everyone else's behavior. So let me say I acknowledge the importance of reaction, and in fact, it may be a test of agility. Having said that, what we find in our experience is it requires a kind of intellectual humility to take a walk around the future. I say again, we do not claim as futurists to have perfect knowledge of the future and futures data in the traditional scientific sense. But what we find is that when people walk around the future and they come back to today, what they think about today changes, and the way they make decisions will change. So for us, the first step is to do a risk-free meander around the future. Of course, you require a little bit of curiosity for that. You require some creativity. You certainly require some imagination. That's not because we just want to imagine things and make them up, but that imagination is important in sketching what Matt in the comments there is referring to as scenarios, and what is it Jordan is asking about, are you in favor of using scenarios for designing strategy or testing strategy? If the question is either or, I think scenarios can work for both. Why is this work important? An investigation, an interrogation of multiple possible futures is an intellectual rehearsal. And that intellectual rehearsal leads to new insights, not predictive insights, but enriching insights, insights that may enhance the quality of our decision making. We know that militaries play an enormous role in global dynamics, absolutely without a shadow of a doubt. But it's exactly because the role is so important that it must be treated with such sensitivity. And the reality is, if you accept the premise that the world is moving at hyperspeed, why should the military be somehow immune to that? Of course, I'm not arguing for a moment that we should change strategic direction on a whim or on a thought or on a day-to-day basis. The point simply is this: to what extent is our longer-term strategic thinking about the military informed by the future?
Okay, thank you, Dr. Mostert. Then Professor Noordman posed a question. I don't know if you can see the question on your screen. It's to me, it's a little bit cryptic. I think you might understand it a bit better.
Let's see. He says, how to beat OPAC, especially cultures and habits, how to overcome these mental models. Imaginative scenario planning, how creative are we to imagine our futures? I think Matt gives us a very good challenging question there towards the end. How imaginative are we really? Remember, thinking is, in relative terms, a fairly inexpensive thing to do. And yet, of course, finding good examples is a rare treat. Why do I say that? Why is this so important? Because thinking and imagination that Matt illustrates so powerfully there are ways, in fact, Matt, of freeing ourselves intellectually from those opaque elements, from the origins, patterns, attitudes, traditions, cultures, and habits. Those opaque elements are important, but from a futures innovation perspective, cannot be the pure determinants of the future. Otherwise, all our conversations about innovation and future competitiveness are really moot. They're really empty rhetoric. Doesn't respond at all to recent changes. Again, we must be careful not to step in a binary trap, saying, well, it's either the opaque from a time gone by, or it's a radical, constant, hyper change environment. It's certainly not that. There's a real world here. And that real world means let's, yes, appreciate the opaque elements, but let us have the intellectual courage and, dare I say, the intellectual playfulness to have a meander around the future. Now, part of that process, if I can just respond as directly as I can, in our experience, is to have in the room with you what we call multiple partial views, a term all the complexity theorists in the world in the room will recognize. Multiple partial views. In other words, more than one view, all of them relating to a divergence of parts of the future. Otherwise, it's the good old echo chamber effect. And the echo chamber is one way of consolidating the past. In other words, if we're talking to large numbers of people who already think what we're thinking, we're essentially talking to ourselves. And when we're doing that, we're simply reinforcing the future. So broadening the diversity of voices in the room, and by that, of course, I mean far beyond racial diversity, as important as that is. I mean intellectual diversity, philosophical diversity, discipline diversity, approach diversity, methodological diversity. Such diversity richness presents us with a rich tapestry of possible futures. Once you've seen that, you cannot come back to today and make the same decisions.
Oh, yeah, thank you. And then Professor Nootman's response to that is intellectual playfulness, which is a great concept. Thank you. Yeah. I don't see any other comments or any other questions. We still have a bit of time. I don't know, Morna, if you want to maybe, just maybe a few other comments, because I know this is something that you are very excited about, that you would like to share with us. Otherwise, we can always move on to the next panel, but the floor is still yours if you want to utilize your time.
Thank you, Dr. Nell. Yes, sometimes we arrive at the future more quickly than anticipated. I do think, in all sobriety, in all good conscience, that what we discover in our work all over the world is that as competitor consciousness increases, in other words, as institutions, whether they're businesses or any other kind of entity, as they start becoming conscious of what the competitor is up to, so their curiosity of the future increases. When they are inwardly looking and backwardly oriented, right? Look inside ourselves. We're a special case. We're different. We're a unique brand of all of this. And they look at their own history. They can very often be quite defensive of current practices. But when they develop their consciousness of what the competitor is up to, we find they become slightly more curious about what the future may hold. And so that may be one way in which institutions invoke their own curiosity about the future, is a development of curiosity not only about ourselves and our past, but also the future of our competitors and how we will develop sustainable competitiveness in the future. And then, Dr. Nell, if people are interested in in that little research brief I wrote. Perhaps I can drop it in the chat, and people are very welcome to have a look at it there. Thank you.
That would be great. I see Professor Heiningen actually posted another question for you. Given your work on the future of work, what is your take on the future of the military profession?
Well, again, I mean, I like the challenge by Professor Heiningen, but I will say just again that, you know, as a futurist, we don't claim perfect knowledge of the future as you would in a traditional science. I think there's something of the answer in his question, in the sense that the idea of it as a profession is certainly something that is developing, and I think will continue to develop. That it is much more of a comprehensive, lifelong learning, intellectually agile, highly curious professional development with continuous professional development points and everything else that goes along with that. That is certainly one dimension. The second, I would say, major driver is, and again, everybody has a reading of futures in a different way, but I think in addition to defense, of course, the great phenomenon of peace, and those two accents are slightly different on military futures, you know, defense versus peace. We can see certainly in some of the largest militaries in the world how that shift is starting to take place. So I would say from an individual perspective, certainly the professionalization will increase, and from an overall objective perspective, I do think that that peace starts to develop a greater accent than defense. And then finally, I would say that we can expect a greater transdisciplinarity in the profession. It's already, of course, starting to happen in many militaries around the world, but that you have a diversity of intellectual richness in that military profession, which is increasingly more broadly defined to include, of course, not simply to be very crude about it, the study of war and defense, but something much more holistic as a global player in international relations. I think that bodes for an exciting future for the military profession.
Oh, thank you. I see now the questions keep popping up. There's a question that OPAs are deeply rooted in military institutions, and what, in your opinion, needs to change fundamentally to drift into the new futures thinking? Thanks
very much. I would say, if you look at that, if it's OPACH that you're referring to there, of course, origins we can't change. And there's no real need to change them, but I think we're interpreting them differently for new future thinking. In other words, we're not just sort of hanging on to them because they are our origins. We're willing to expand our definition of ourselves beyond our origins. On patterns, I think if we're trying to be a bit practical about this, and Dr. Nell, quite distinct from your good self, I've been accused of many things in my life, but never really of being a practical man. On the patterns, I think that the first thing there is to get towards a sort of honest consensus of the patterns. Let us be honest. Let us be honest how we celebrate. Let us be honest about how we make decisions, how we respond in a crisis, what we fund, what we defund, how we treat talent, how we engage with the political realm, and so on. So honest consensus on the patterns, I think, are increasingly important. Attitudes undoubtedly will enjoy greater attention in the next decade or so, and we can see that in the rise of sentiment, just as a popular dialogue in various other fields. Traditions, of course, have their place, bearing in mind that tradition can be a celebration and can also be a trap. And I think those who are future-minded are curious about future traditions. What are the new things that we begin to celebrate, that we begin to pay more attention to? culture, of course, is shifting dramatically, and I mean, we can see even in some transnational military forces the idea that nationality doesn't govern culture in those forces. And I think that's a major shift in many military environments. And then the big thing about habits is that habits are essentially things that we do without thinking. And so that's a fascinating idea when you consider thinking habits. What is a thinking habit if a habit is something that you do without thinking? Well, a thinking habit then means that you're thinking without really thinking. In other words, what we're needing there is a kind of metacognition, a consciousness of the way we make decisions, our decision-making methodologies, not only, of course, out in the field, but at an institutional design, institutional advancement level. How do we make those decisions? I think is one of the ways that that we change into alternative futures.
Okay, so we have two more, and I think I'm going to give you these two questions. The one asks for your opinion, the other one is a question, and I think that is what we should we'll probably have enough time for. The first one is that Brigadier General John Thuis would like your opinion on his question is, does the military plan the futures on their own, or do you see a whole of government approach, which I think is quite an interesting one as well. And then the second question is by Colonel Andre de Jager, who wants to know, what is the future of violence? If a military's purpose is to maintain a level of monopoly on organized violence, what will violence be used for in the future?
Gosh. Well, no easy question to start with, is there? But I mean, these are just such fantastic questions, and how wonderful that SIGLA creates the platform where we can give air to these ideas. On the Brigadier General's question, again, I'm giving a perspective from our science, recognizing, of course, that other sciences bring their own voice to the party. From our perspective, we are by default systems thinkers in our approach, which means that we're always more curious about the nature of connections than the nature of separation. And so for that reason, to the Brigadier General, I would argue that there are certainly many examples that the Brigadier General will know much better than I do, of the crises that occurred where militaries tried to go it alone. There are, of course, traps to be stepped into when in theory we do a whole government approach, but in fact, it's not a whole government approach in truth, it's essentially a political approach. That is equally dangerous. So if we can distinguish a whole government approach from a political approach, then I would say we're leaning towards a whole government rather than you know, a sort of military-driven approach. And of course, as an eternal optimist, it would be wonderful to imagine that we have an intergovernment approach, which I think will get a great deal more attention in the next decade or so. The future of violence, I would say, certainly one of those futures, when we look at complexity science, one of the drivers of complexity science is dematerialization. Dematerialization. In other words, what used to be physical and tangible, such as machines in the first industrial revolution, are becoming conceptual, intangible, almost undefinable, dematerialized components. In other words, if we apply that idea to violence, then I think one of the places we're moving as a society is that we're recognizing different forms of violence, not to broaden the discussion to a level of lunacy, but consider, for example, gender-based violence. Consider the violence inflicted on people at the Belarus border. Consider the violence inflicted on people trying to escape from Calais to the UK across the Channel. Those, one could argue, are not military-led examples of violence, but they are nevertheless somehow a violent imposition on our overall humanity. And I think increasingly militaries will play a role in these more subtle, more nuanced forms of violence, as I hope we become a more sensitive society overall.
Okay, Dr. Mosse, thank you so much. This has been, once again, as always, very thought-provoking, very interesting discussions. Our time, unfortunately, is up. So I would like to hand over as panel chair to Professor Lindy Heineken. Thanks, Lindy.
Thanks so much.
Good afternoon, everyone. And it's so lovely to see so many familiar names. I can't see everybody's faces in this virtual room this afternoon to listen to these various debates. And I think in South Africa, but in particular, debates around these type of issues are really crucial. So I've also got the privilege of introducing three of my former colleagues from a different life to what I'm leading right now to do a presentation. The first speaker is Professor Ian van der Waagt, whose bio you've seen from the Department of Military History at the Faculty of Military Science. All three speakers are from the University of Stellenbosch, sitting at various places within the university. And I'm giving a historical perspective then. And then next we have Professor Francois Frey, on influencing military futures, and then we're going to jump from there, although there's definitely a golden thread through all these three presentations, to Dr. Moses Kanyili, who's going to speak about the defense industry. So I'm not going to steal any one of your time. If you go radically over time, I'm just going to put my hand up for the speakers. But Ian, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Heineken, for that very kind introduction. And I'd just like to thank the conference organizers too for the invitation to share a few thoughts on the historical dimension this afternoon. I'm just going to quickly open my presentation, which you should now be able to see. To share. There we go. After that sparkling presentation, I'm now going to take you back to the past, so to speak. And I have 15 minutes to address a very large topic. So if I skip along quite quickly, please forgive me. We can always come back to certain things during the question time. Now, the first thing I'd like to do is to acknowledge the complexity of the South African case. The South African way of war, if we can call it that, has developed, of course, over many centuries, you can argue millennia, and it goes back to various roots. So there's a far larger picture that we need to take cognizance of here. And with that too, of course, a number of influences that came in at different times that have shaped our strategic culture and our military culture. And I will refer to those things over the next few minutes. Of course, there are four essential qualities that armed forces look at and have done so historically. It doesn't matter which of our ancestral forces we look at. And quoting Col Vuono, these, of course, are versatility, deployability, lethality, and, of course, expansibility, or the ability to grow very rapidly in response to a massive outbreak of hostilities or change of circumstances. Now, of course, change and innovation are two very different things. If we think about innovation, one thinks of perhaps enhancing these qualities inside armed forces. But of course, at the same time, there are some changes that can be counterproductive and can affect these qualities: versatility, deployability, lethality, and expansibility in a very negative way. And if we take a look at the last 100 years or so, we can see examples of this at different times. Now, of course, any discussion of military failure takes us to Heller and Stoft, their book on first battles, and the whole notion, that you don't actually know if what you're doing during peacetime is good until you face that first battle experience in the next war. Then, of course, we have Cohen and Gooch and their book on military failures. And, through the examination, they come up with a whole range of different scenarios, which you will see I have listed there with the examples that they use, going through from failure to learn, to anticipate, to adapt, aggregate failure, and then, of course, catastrophic failure, such as France faced in 1940. And South Africa has been very fortunate not to have perhaps progressed quite fully through the list of those 6 things. The picture in the background, of course, these are some of the POWs that were taken at Sidi Rezai, and then, of course, the larger military disaster that happened at Tobruk. And it was this disaster, perhaps the largest in South Africa's military history, that, of course, led to a very robust debate within the Defence Force to find out exactly what had happened. And I have a copy of the Tobruk report here. I don't know if you can see it as I raise it. A very thick, perhaps 2 to 3 inch thick document. So this committee sat in London. The debate was very robust, and they generated this document that led to a number of changes. And the important thing, really, coming back to Cohen and Gooch, is to underline the organizational dimension of strategy, and that very often one sees this is not a question of individual shortcomings, but perhaps the shortcomings at an organizational systemic level that leads to catastrophes of those sorts of kinds. Then I'd also like to make reference to Murray and Millett, in the one chapter in their one book on military innovation in the interwar period, where the author talks of the relationships in innovation. And, when military innovations come, they really have their greatest influence when they are able to change the context within which war takes place. And perhaps the most obvious example, if one can quote one very quickly, would be Hugh Dowding, the GOC of Fighter Command just before and after the outbreak of the Second World War, with the advent of the Spitfire, the Hurricane, the radar systems actually led to operational level change that altered materially our notions onwards as far as air warfare goes. And of course, South Africa could tap into the wider British Empire and Commonwealth, and of course also make their contributions to the development of radar, for example, over the years. And there's a great piece of work by Doug Delaney, who's a professor at the RMC in Kingston, called the Imperial Army Project. And he really sort of argues, that in many cases, the Dominions and other Commonwealth countries could piggyback on British developments, which sometimes they shared the success in perhaps bringing through. Now, as far as South Africa is concerned, if we take a look at the past century, I think there are a couple of things that are quite striking. One, of course, is the continuous and often rapid change that happened within the country over that century plus of duration. And within this space, we see that at least 5 wars were fought. I'm not counting these smaller, military events that perhaps don't quite class as wars. We have 5 peacetime periods, of course, in the intervening spaces, and the country also, the armed forces, went through 3 amalgams or integrations, if you will, involving intensive post-conflict organizational change. And as I argue in my military history of modern South Africa, these occurred as a succession of historical waves, which I've tried to illustrate on the slide that you now have in front of you. So if we take a look at the century, I've marked off those wars in red, as you can see there, starting with the Anglo-Boer War, and then moving through to what we might call the War for Southern Africa, including the Border War, the Bush War, and all the other campaigns, if you will, as part of that late Cold War conflict. Now, if we take a look at the wars, of course, these were intensive periods. There was a lot of happening inside the armed forces. We can see rapid change happening. Things had to happen very quickly because very specific problems perhaps had now become manifest. The armed forces had to deploy sometimes to far off theaters of war. So these foreign deployments demanded certain things. And at different times, the Defence Ministry, and in 2 cases, 1914 and 1939, of course, we're looking at Jan Smuts, who was the Defence Minister, as well as in the second instance, Prime Minister. He could go through a process of modernizing the Defence Force. So there was a strong top-down, if you will, driver who had great energy, was willing to expend money to mobilize the manpower of the country to prosecute these wars. And we can see in terms of WONO's 4 qualities, in terms of expansibility, deployability, lethality, and of course versatility, we see all of these things playing out, particularly with regard to the Second World War. Then, of course, what you see also marked out here very interestingly on the slide, of course, are the 3 amalgams, which followed 3 of these wars. And the first amalgam, of course, came after the formation of the Union of South Africa in 1910. We see the making of the Union Defence Force as the first armed force for this new state. It was also a new army from old, in the sense that they raked up, from the different colonies, colonial volunteers, some British instructors, former Boer commandos, and pushed them into this new structure. And then very soon afterwards, in fact, just 2 years after, they were, of course, pushed off to go to war. And we see the First World War breaking out. And of course, these men, and they were all men back then, brought with them their hardwiring, the way that they thought about the military and how the military should look. And they brought this into the UDF in 1912. If we look at the person of Christian Beyers for one, and in fact took the First World War for somebody like Smuts, in fact, to, can one say, clean the stable out and to recast this defence force along more modern lines, as I believe he'd always wanted to do. Right, then of course we have the second amalgam after the Second World War, coming to power in 1948 of the National Party, and of course the advent of Defence Minister Franz Erasmus. And I think we perhaps recognize this perhaps as an intensive period of change once again inside the Defence Force, but perhaps also change in the sense that Erasmus was one of the men that would look back rather than forward, and to try and recreate the old, or certainly some of the elements of the old Boer forces in the new SADF that he was shaping at the time. And then, of course, we have the third amalgam after 1994, after the first fully democratic elections. Once again, a new army from old. A variety of different people were brought in from various quarters, the SADF, the TBVC countries, and of course the non-stat or the liberation forces, all of whom, of course, too, had intellectual roots in different military cultures. So we see a new welding together of things that wouldn't happen immediately. These things also take time. All right, and then of course we have the current SANDF period and operations perhaps other than war, but different to perhaps the preceding periods in terms of the kinds of tasks that the SANDF now undertakes. Importantly, however, I think in terms of the transformation that came, perhaps reminiscent of the immediate post-48 period, was that the focus here was heavily on the human transformation, perhaps at the neglect of some of the other things that might have happened. Then I'd like to make quick reference to Murray and Millett once again. And Murray and Millett come up with a really nice framework where they take a look at change inside armed forces, and they stage this down through the levels of war, if you will, starting with the strategic framework at the top, which of course is seated in what we might call strategic culture. Then we have the organization and the factors that sort of shape the institution. And here, of course, we have something called military culture, which I believe forms the bedrock, perhaps, of what happens at that level. And then at a third level, they take a look at the doctrinal framework of the different services and how change might be effected there. Now, in terms of the strategic framework, and I think I need to skip through this quite quickly in terms of the time, but strategic culture, as I said, of course, is very important. This is shaped by what the Soviets used to call permanently operating factors. So it's the geography of the country, the climate, the traditional opponents, perhaps too, the sorts of factors that perhaps have more permanence and shape the longer term thinking. And don't forget, strategic culture is at a level higher than the Department of Defense. This is actually seated at the policy national level. So the impact of the last war, of course, helped shape the strategic environment and the way in which armed forces prepare for the future. It shapes questions like how the military and political leaders view potential enemies, how the services might view their overall strategic missions into the future, and of course, how they conceive the next year, the next 5 years, 10 years, and so on. And this shapes bigger questions. It includes the probability of war over these periods, or of operations, perhaps in today's terms, the anticipated theatres of these operations, the immediacy in time and distance, and of course this affects certain military decisions in terms of lifting personnel, for example, and mobilizing sufficient force if one needs more than the immediate permanent force for this particular task. And then of course also the length of conflict. How long would this conflict possibly last, and would one have the time potentially to lift the personnel and send them off? This was one of the big decisions they had to make at the outbreak of the Korean War, for example, in 1950, when the first thinking was the war would be over before a squadron could get to Korea. Then at a level lower, we have the organizational factors. This treats questions such as, the common vision regarding the threat assessment, and is there a common vision? And we'll see, throughout South Africa's military history, this was actually a very contested thing, depended who one asked, of course, at the time. The role of allies, and who might those allies be? What sort of forces would one design, and the size? Issues of funding, access to technological resources, of course, and of course congruence between political objectives and the force capabilities of the armed force that is now being designed. Underlying this, of course, is this question of military culture. How do armed forces also think about this? And of course, a robust military culture is extremely important. Military culture is not about buttons and stripes and the rest. Okay, it's about the military debate and how the military think about their task. So very important, are innovations or innovators in their thinking accepted or discouraged inside the Defence Force? And that of course changed also over the 100 years. The move toward garrison statehood, I think from the 1950s and 60s, saw things generally closing down. And of course, the role of professional military education, and the capacity to adapt. How important is this PME? How robust is the military education, things that happen, for example, at the military academy and other defense colleges inside the Defence Force? So these are very big questions. Then at a level lower, we can look at the doctrinal framework of the services, and this really, takes a look at, how do armed forces learn and draw lessons, from past conflicts in order to try to do better again, in inverted commas. How robust is the evaluation of the doctrine? What sort of potential opponents are there? What does that mean in terms of doctrinal change? How serious are the services in terms of the doctrinal principles when they are incorporated into training and shape force design? And on each case, each occasion in which South Africa went to war, be that 1914, 1938, 1968, if we take that as a year, South Africa was really poorly positioned in this regard. It was perhaps the level at which the greatest failure happened. So very briefly, what are the drivers for military innovation over this period? One, of course, is that there is a specific problem that had to be overcome. Without a specific problem on the table, the money was not there, the thinking largely did not happen, or if it did, the people were perhaps not always heard. Strategic and military culture, absolutely fundamental here. Where we have instances of weakness in this regard, we can see, of course, that the drivers perhaps did not always ring through. The rapid pace of technological change, of course, this played a role too, and we can see that at different times in the shaping of South Africa's first Air Force, for example, and the drive to get new weapon systems at subsequent stages as well. All right, so the drivers have been multifarious, but we see the same sorts of things that are repeated in each of these cycles that are indicated earlier. And of course, there are a number of constraints that have also shown through during the period. And these constraints, of course, tend to weigh in more heavily during the periods of peace, if we look at our cycles. And some of these constraints, of course, were external. If we take a look, for example, at post-conflict pacifism, after 1918, the revulsion, in terms of the loss and the carnage on the Western Front, for example, led to a massive anti-military movement in the country. And I think we see similar things in the later stages as well. Of course, during times of peace, the defense budgets are also far tighter. There's less money for this sort of thing when it comes down to a choice between bread and butter, this and bread and butter issues. And of course, also, defense forces tend to be very bleak places, during inter-war, inter-conflict periods. So very often, the military men who may have get up and go literally get up and go. They leave. They don't stay in the structure. And of course, this weakens the strategic and the military culture of the organization. Very often the innovators vacate the defense force after a year or two after the war. We can see that, in 1924, 1948, and various other periods. Then, of course, there are a number of constraints that might be internal. And defense forces are one of those organizations that use their history far more actively than most others. Doesn't matter which armed force you look at. And of course, history is used to try and do better in future. This is what one always hears. And one of the constraints, I think, in terms of thinking about the future is the way in which history is misused or abused. And one hears so often, of the need for lessons and to learn lessons from past campaigns. Or you pick up a military manual, doesn't matter from what period, and you see here are listed the 7 lessons, from the Battle of Kursk, which of course, from an historical point of view is absolute nonsense. So the shoehorning of lessons is a problem. And of course, latching onto what the previous speaker he mentioned there that, more than one future is possible. I'd like to add there, that more than one past is probable. It all depends on who you ask. These are the lessons that you will deduce. So this is something, of course, that one has to be very careful with. Then, of course, there's rigidity, the opposition to change that you'll have from traditionalists, and they have been in the defense force in reasonably large numbers over this period, starting with the Christian Bayers that I mentioned in 1912, and we can take it through. And then, of course, there's the question of poor budgeting. The money that is received isn't always, I think, perhaps directed in the area of innovation, as has been debated in the popular press more recently. Again, so a few words just by way of conclusion. I think we perhaps again at a time of increased political, strategic, and technological uncertainty, and it's important perhaps to take a look at, even from the past, to take a look at how armed forces can perhaps position themselves to take something from the past and the present and try and shape what this future, uncertain future might hold. And I'd like this quote from James Lefanu, who wrote a very interesting history of modern medicine. And he spoke there, about change in the medical field, but I think it's true for the military field too. The urgency of conflict accelerates the pace of innovation. And this has been very true for South Africa over the last 100 years, and I suppose for any other armed force over the same period. Very important, of course, the diversity of the paths of innovation, that they have to be multifaceted across a broad front, embrace really needed to be seeded into the military and strategic culture, I would say, of the organization and of the country. Secondly, carried along by a strong undercurrent of ideas and events. They need to have a fertile bed in which they can grow and propagate and germinate. State funding, massively important in terms of military change in South Africa. This has only really happened at the start of large conflicts, when all of a sudden there's a scramble to pour money, into the defense force to try and shore up an armed force that can be sent somewhere to make a difference. And then the last point I just mentioned, there's the need for central direction, but without, very importantly, without the political straitjacketing. And I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ian, for that fascinating presentation. And it was interesting how the first one was asking us to really look into the future and imagine the future, where your presentation brings through very strongly how important looking at our past and understanding our past and how it can influence the future is a key consideration, which feeds very nicely into our next presenter, Francois Frey, on taking these lessons and thinking about the future. How are we thinking about influencing military futures and military trained contours? So Professor Francois Frey, he's our host today, professor working at head of SIGLA. So it's the floor is yours.
Thanks. I'm just seeing the PowerPoint's coming up. There it is. Yep, I've listened to the two presentations, and I think I've got more work cut out for me to be able to keep in step with what was said. Influencing military futures is the topic that I would briefly like to discuss. And by way of an introduction, to set a scene, look at military change, mediating influences, and then a couple of concluding remarks. Defense policy, the political realm, is the ambit that directs armed forces towards future roles. But it's military leaders that prepare the armed forces for alternative military roles, where the signposts are planted at the political level, particularly in terms of departments of defense and how they interact with other departments. Military futures are therefore a political responsibility, and they do require a political lead. It is not encouraged, and it is dangerous to think or to expect or to have armed forces drag themselves into the future according to their own agendas. Because if we get this wrong in terms of preparing the armed forces for the future, that is when we increase the defense dilemma. And remember, the defense dilemma is a bit different from the security dilemma, because the defense dilemma that you have to face eventually, or could face, is about military defeat, the threat that you are unprepared for a future armed conflict or military conflict, and you either get defeated or your losses imply that you have to sue for peace and you have to bear the brunt of conditions that get imposed on you. So in this realm, it's also about getting it wrong is for a non-vote winning department and its responsibilities that could well lead to political collapse, because military defeat often goes hand in hand with the political collapse of a country or even of a government or a reigning party. So mitigating the risk for future strategic mismatches is ultimately a goal by looking towards the future and setting up and working from the political level through your military setup to see how you could minimize future strategic mismatches. We listened to South Africa, for example, in the previous presentation by Professor van der Waag, but we can also look, for example, at the Russians and not necessarily at the Americans or other Western countries, how the Russians type of directed and redirected their armed forces after the Cold War, when they type of stumbled in Chechnya and they got it terribly wrong. And how the Ukraine and Georgia and Syria type of became signposts for the military about getting back on track, not perfectly, not quickly, but they first had to go into getting it terribly wrong in Chechnya before they really, by way of political and military and their military industrial adjustments, began to put themselves on a better futures pathway, having to deal with different types of threats, whether created or whether arising in the Ukraine, in Georgia, for example, and in Syria. So, setting the scene, we live in a time of contracted space for defense, and that defense has to find its feet, maintain itself, and play a role in a collapsing security spaces. Health security is on the agenda, climate security is on the agenda, human security is on the agenda. We can look at economic security, etc. But security through defense, by having your military entities being ready, combat ready, and prepared to play its role, that space is shrinking all the more, in spite of the military being expected to play a role as these collapsing security spaces take over the political thinking, the responses, and the calls to countries, to governments to do something. So while traditional military threats are also always posed as primary, holding the greatest danger, they are simultaneously, in some countries, in some regions and continents, also becoming more peripheral, where they are not seen, expected, or type of prioritized to take the primary role. So updates over time or major repositioning is an imperative if you work in such an uncertain futures environment that you have to prepare for. And here we look at interactive emergencies and co-plexic conditions, the wording coming from a publication that I read about trying to explain the complexity that militaries face, that defense faces, and how politicians must really be sharp, wake up, and keep in step with where they want to place and prepare their armed forces to play its role. So, yeah, there is the room, the requirement, and the imperative for aligning defense and military futures and repositioning your military to play that role in future. So you don't want to end up in a defense cul-de-sac over time because of neglect. And therefore, positioning your military for the future really already began yesterday. If we can have a look at military change, Professor van der Waag touched upon quite a number of important matters. So taking it forward and not looking back, is merging war and interwar periods for military change is important, because I think that's the reality we are facing. We are not, and particularly then, for example, South Africa is not really in the game at the moment of merging war and interwar periods to look at the immediate future that should be served through defense service delivery by the South African military. Military change is led by defense politics, and that is something that I want to underline, and that the complexity gets mediated by cooperative future militaries that the first speaker referred to upon one of the questions. You must be able to cooperate, and you must map your military futures around how do you cooperate with different actors, even those actors that you don't like. You will probably get to a point where you have to cooperate with them. So context setting for alternative military futures is critical. We had some context setting in the first presentation, but the context setting that we have here is that also that there's a persistent premise of reduced but effective future armed forces. And this is really a dilemma for defense and military decision makers. You must become smaller, use less resources, but you must do better to be able to deal with the future. And we don't really know what future we're going to expect you to deal with if you only speak to or satisfy the one side. So future electoral dividends are always in the minds of the politicians that have the responsibility to map and direct defense futures. And ultimately, in these times, it's about for them of containing wasteful militaries. And then political contraction and geographic and operational expansion is probably part of the future that politicians will expect their militaries to deal with. So how do you mediate influences? Don't fall out of step with politico-military futures pathways that you have to negotiate. Falling out of step makes it expensive, it makes it more demanding of time, and it also creates a type of a difficulty about you have to deal with more futures because you're just totally out of step, because you did not keep up with your environments as Professor van der Waag mapped out. And then you get to military futures trajectories that are evolutionary or disruptive. And probably if you are out of step, you get to face both of them. The evolutionary path you wish to embark, but you're already faced by the disruptive side that requires more and quicker fixes. Technology, we will hear more about technology in the next presentation, and in the SIGLA brief that preceded this event, we also found matters of technology being addressed there. But technology is a co-creator of how the world and the battle space unfolds. It is not only a quick fix and a silver bullet how to dominate. You have to understand, get to grips, and take note and deal with the one, how you got to this position before you can deal, how does technology help me to mitigate this? The experiment to test the art of what is possible is a mediating influence. Military should be allowed to do this. They should be allowed to test, to experiment, to exercise, to make mistakes. Rather mistakes in experiments and exercises than mistakes on the battlefield. Therefore, your research initiatives that can test and experiment with concept technology creations is an important facet. Then, of course, recast the concept of war from battlefield victory to what? And this is, if we say that the military leaders must prepare the military for what the politicians want, this question must be answered by the politicians. It's difficult, they shy away from it, but that's the question they must answer for themselves to direct their militaries. And also new sources of power, the hard-soft divide, and the skill to combine the two for effect. So emergent threats brings about, and this is something that I've really picked up in GUA Future War 2018 at the bottom. Strategic military imperatives, emergent threats, and then emergent sciences and technologies. They form a triad that can help to negotiate this future's pathway because they bring around questions, they bring around certain solutions, and they bring certain answers to the fore. Then in conclusion, I want to refer to overcome societal and political skepticism with credible military futures. Work hard at it, master them, and lower the threat of the defense dilemma and getting it terribly wrong. If you lower the defense dilemma, then you lower the defeat of a nation, of your national sovereignty, and all the matters that politicians and militaries almost cling to as this is why we are here And this is why we have the democratic right to make certain decisions. Credible futures, therefore, ally with political responsibilities to bring about military effectiveness. And to do this, you need knowledge clusters that are vested in academic research and study groups. The literature in this regard points to the fact that the knowledge clusters that are desired may overlap or may also reside in your defense politics and in your military leadership and in the military cluster. All of them won't be there. You have to create them, you have to build them, you have to nurture them, and you have to make use of them over time. You can't call upon them because you're in a dead end. Defense dead ends puts militaries into military stasis and military dead ends. If you look at the academic research and study groups, they are probably the go-tos and the catalysts to get you out of defense dead ends. Drifting into destructive military futures versus design, structure, and prepare, where do you want to go? The first one of drifting into destructive military futures points the finger back at the politicians getting it wrong about defense futures. And therefore, the ultimate question, do you want to direct your military towards more warfighting or more constructive futures? Overall, you need an actionable defense roadmap that will take you towards military futures. So the couple of minutes that I had, Professor Heineck and Lindy, thank you for the time. Thank you to the audience who listened to this. Thank you that I could do the presentation.
Thank you very much, Francois, and a really important presentation, specifically where South Africa finds itself presently as well. So we are a little bit over time, so I'm not going to waste your time. And I'm going to immediately introduce our next speaker, Dr. Moses Kanyeli, who's going to speak about the defense industry, and he's from CMS.
Thank you so much, Prof. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
Can you see the presentation?
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Prof. And colleagues around the virtual table. I really appreciate the opportunity to come and share some perspectives on this topic. The topic being the future of the South African defense industry and its complex relationship with government. Now, as all the speakers have demonstrated beyond doubt, that both the future and the past are very important. And that when you are dealing with the future and the past, those things have to happen in the present. We've heard about the OPACH approach. We've heard about the amalgams, or the three amalgams that Prof. Van der Wag shared with us, and the issues of disconnect in terms of the politicians, how they look at military change from Prof. Frey. One thing all these have done, these presentations have done, is to confirm that regardless of where you're operating in terms of time, you will still need tools to do your job. And those tools in the military context will most probably come from the defense industry. And we've also heard that the easiest thing that we can do as military planners and academics is to blame the past. But also, the biggest mistake is that we tend to forget what happened in the past. So my contention here is that the defense industry provides that golden thread between the past and the present to ensure that for the politicians or for government to do what it needs to do in the present scenario, it has to have taken cognizance of what had happened in the past, and therefore being able to do things for the future. In fact, if you look at what the industry can do, the products that come from the industry last for many years. I'm aware of aircraft that have been around for 60 years, still operating today. Rattles that have been around for ages, and straddling all some of the amalgams that Professor van der Wag alluded to. But that's not what I'm here to talk about. What I'm here to talk about is to look at how does the industry relate or interact with government, and what are the critical issues that need to be addressed for the future. And what I intend doing is to first provide a basic overview what is happening in terms of the industry, because I don't want to assume that everybody understands these aspects of the defense industry. I'll then move on to look at how the industry interfaces with government, a very basic level. And then I'll move on to look at some of the challenges that the SANDF is currently facing, just picking up on some of the indicators where there seems to be a disconnect between the industry and government. We'll then look at the defense industry market trajectory, where we start asking some questions, both through the lenses of government and those of the industry. Colleagues, as you might be aware, the industry could be defined or could be looked at from different angles. And I know that this gets even more trickier as technology advances, but from the industry perspective, there are basically at least two classes of players in the industry. You have companies that are producing products and services exclusively for the defense market. Whatever leaves the factory floor can only be consumed by the defense market, nothing else. And then you have those that do dual production or who cater for both the civilian and military markets. So they produce some products and some services for the defense and security market. This basically means that in the event that there's winter, as it were, that there's nothing happening in the defense space, they can always ramp up on the civilian side of things. But there are other variations of players in the defense space who, including those that are catering primarily for the civilian space, but also can be consumed. Their products and services can also be consumed by the defense. I mean, vehicles, your normal vehicles, food, and things like that. So we don't necessarily classify those as defense industry. But these two categories that I've mentioned are relevant because they are regarded as a particular sector. There are significant players in the sector. Now, from the ownership perspective, those could be coming from the private sector or could be owned by government. They could be registered here at home, locally in South Africa, or could be headquartered or registered elsewhere, and providing services to the defense force. In terms of key stakeholders in this space, you have an industry association called AMD, Aerospace, Maritime and Defense Association. Now, this is a member-based organization of some 3,000 or so members, but it does not necessarily mean that everybody that represents the sum total of all the players in the defense industry. There are those that are not affiliated to AMD, in other words, operating on their own. Government has got export councils from different sectors, and in the space of defense, there is the SA, what is called a SAMDEC, that takes care of all the export requirements for the industry. And then you have ARMSCO as the acquisition agency. So now this is very important. You have guys who produce things, and you have an agency that procures things on behalf of government. Now, this, if you look at this, there is a demand side and a supply side. The industry plays in the supply side. So which means my input is primarily on the supply side. Now, the performance of the supply side tends to be linked in large part on what happens on the demand side. The plight of the industry today is generally attributed to issues on the demand side, particularly the domestic market. That is where you'll find the SANDF and other departments that will be using services and products from the defense industry. Things like your bulletproof vests, armor-plated vehicles, and all of those things. Those are not necessarily used exclusively by the defense force. The private sector industry as well does play in that space. But then the industry also supplies export market, international customers out there. For the industry to perform, it relies or is guided by the regulator. The regulator being the National Conventional Arms Control Committee, NCACC, that issues permits for certain things. Now, if you don't understand these issues, in other words, well, who's the industry, who are the players in the industry, and the market dynamics, you will always think that maybe the SNDF is doing something wrong or the industry is doing something wrong. And yet there is a symbiotic relationship that links the three. And regardless as to of what the industry does, if government, that is now the regulator, is not pulling its weight, then you will always have problems. Now, how does the industry interface with government? It interfaces with government primarily in terms of providing services. Services in terms of new equipment and services, and MRO, maintenance, repair, and overhaul, fixing things that are already there, and more importantly, especially as it relates to our current discussion, R&D, research and development. But it also has, it interfaces with the industry through consultative structure that is recently established, I think 2-3 years ago, the National Defense Industry Council. That comprises heads of our government and industry, is chaired by the minister, but delegated to the Secretary for Defense. Now, this is the most powerful but underutilized structure that government has, because there is no other structure in the government system that has got such a high concentration of heads of department other than the defense industry. And yet, when it comes to dealing with issues of industry, there's a lot that still can be done there. Now, if you look at the disconnect between the industry and the SANDF, you could see that translating in terms of impact at various levels, starting with the operational level. You can see that as we speak, the Air Force's flying hours have been reduced by almost half. Budget for fuel and so on has been reduced, just like it has been done with the Navy, meaning that it can do less in terms of patrols, it can do less in terms of training. And these are the two arms of the Defense Force that are technology heavy in many ways, and these are the game changers when it comes to when it comes to war fighting. Where you can also see the disconnect is in the space of manufacturing. For example, taking the projects that are overseen by Denel. As you all know, Denel has got it's responsible for about 50% of government's capital budget in terms of projects that are allocated to it, simply because of the fact that they are the custodians of a lot of sovereign and strategic capabilities of the SANDF. And it being a state-owned company, it has had an advantage over the rest as far as that goes. But unfortunately, Denel, as you all know, has not been doing well, has been facing, still does face a lot of liquidity issues. Cash flow is an issue there, which has now resulted in some of very big projects of the SANDF being slowed down, stalled, or some of them being terminated. One of those is the Hoefyster, where there's a lot of investment that is spent, that goes into billions, but not much is there to show for that. As you all know, it's in and out of court for this and other reason, in terms of where it gets threatened for liquidation and so on. But the biggest challenge has been in the value chain, the supply chain of Denel, where you have specialist suppliers that only provide that particular service or product for the SANDF. Nobody else can use that. It's only it's only the SANDF that does that, and those have now had to be closed down. And so it's a very dire situation where there is a disconnect with the industry. We can also see this in the inability of Denel to commercialize some of the key projects that are at the high end of technology advancement, like, for example, the ADATA missile technology, which should have been industrialized by now. As you all know, that or some of you might be aware, South Africa is one of those, is in the top 10 countries in terms of missile technology in the world. And but as things stand now, that technology, that capability is dying, if it is not dead already. In fact, South Africa's recognition in terms of defense industry expertise is almost comparable with what is happening in the health space. Today you're talking about people who have detected and isolated this Omicron variant, and that is in South Africa is being hailed around the world for that kind of scale. Now, it is comparable in the defense industry in certain niches of defense capability, and yet, as we speak, that kind of cutting edge technology and recognition is dying down. Well, at least there have been some interventions in the recent past where Denel has been given some money, recapitalization of 1.9 billion in 2019-20 financial year. Last year they got 576 million recapitalization, and the guarantee, state guarantees to the tune of about 6 billion. I'm sorry, I left out a BN there. To the tune of 6 billion was extended. Now, this has to do with the kind of indebtedness that that Denel has. If it does not perform, these companies that extend lines of credit to them will then recall those and if the guarantee is not valid, then it could close down. So at least last year, 6 billion rands worth of guarantees were extended. This year, in November, there was a sigh of relief when 2.9 billion was promised to Denel in the medium-term budget policy statement of the Minister of Finance. Now, that basically shows the kind of disconnect that we're having. The other one is in terms of the special defense account. As you might be aware, the special defense account was specifically developed for purposes of enabling the defense force to invest in multi-year kind of projects without surrendering the money back to Treasury. But in the recent past, that whatever is in the kitty there has been dwindling gradually, and in the recent past, it is gotten even worse. At the last check, we were left with, there was about 1.4 billion, which is close to nothing compared to what used to happen, where if you look at 2019-20 and 2020-21, AMSCO had about 13 billion in that kitty, to either for maintenance or for acquisition. So when you're talking about 1.4 billion being left, then you must know that it means some of the major projects like Project Biro, which has to do with the inshore patrol boats, these big boats, might be in jeopardy. The Project Hotel has to do with the hydrographic vessel. So if there is not enough money to see those two projects through, then that could spell disaster for the country. Now, R&D, research and development, which is basically the backbone of the defense industry, because it is the inquiring mind, the testing of new things, the conceptualization of possibilities of the future, where the R&D comes into play. And most of those things are taken care of through the special defense account. So if the special defense account gets emptied, as it seems to be the case, then you see what happens in terms of R&D. At some point, South Africa is reputed to have had at least close to 7% of the total GDP being invested in R&D in one way or other form, whether it is in defense or in the energy space or whatever. But defense was was the primary beneficiary of that investment. But today that is fast disappearing. Now, AMSCO was specifically established for purposes of being the exclusive and the neutral arbiter of government contracts. If the SDA is depleted, if there are no more major complex acquisitions demanded or expected of SANDF, then that might just cause AMSCO's sustainability to be called into question. But some of the questions that we will need to start looking at from the as we interrogate the future is whether the defense industry should actually be looking at the domestic market or should be more export orientated than anything else. But if that were to be the case, it would mean, therefore, that the state of play will have to change, the rules of the game will have to change, and therefore, government might have to forego certain things. But is it aware of that? Is it also aware of the national security implications that might be stemming from that? to revive the defense industry in future? Is it possible? Because what we have today, in large part, is inherited from the past, the pre-1994 defense industry base. So if you lose that multi-year investment in one go, how do you resuscitate it? It's basically impossible. And what do you do with the industry personnel that we have, given their unique and specialized expertise that they have? There was a talk about the issue of violence. Our understanding of violence and so on. And these are the people who understand what the military requires. What is the best way of winning wars? Now, what do you do with those people? We know that some of the military expertise is portable, that you can use both in the civilian space and in the military space. But unfortunately, when it comes to exportability of military expertise, it becomes a bit tricky because there are so many other international treaties and regulations to which South Africa is a signatory that prohibit the easy transfer of military expertise to other areas, especially the non-state actors, or even if it is non-state actors, if those are not necessarily aligned or good players in terms of the global play or rules of the game of today. So this discussion here is very crucial in terms of where do you locate the defense industry relative to what the military is planning to achieve in future. We also know that even the profile of war is changing or has changed, meaning that while in the past it was we were talking about frontal wars, this war, this one hitting the other, and so on, blood being spilled, and so on. But maybe the nature of our war going forward is going to do less with blood, but more with impact, disrupting this, disrupting that, denying service of this, denying service of that, which means that basically talks to a different profile of your future soldier, a different profile of the definition of victory and the impact, and also the investment that the whole country will need to make in order for the defense force to be in step with the with the future. Those would be my inputs, Chair, for your consideration. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Moses, for that presentation. We are a little bit over time, so I don't know of the organizers how much time I can take for questions and answers, but I think we could probably take 5 or so minutes, unless you would like us to spend more time. But let me have a look at the first comment from Willem Janssen van Rensburg. To all 4 of the speakers today, the 2015 Defence Review touches on many aspects presented today. It is backward-looking, evaluates numerous future scenarios, and is broad enough in scope to include the defence industry. Yet, its milestones outlining South Africa's defence future are not implementable, largely due to funding constraints and lack of political will and direction. From a futures perspective, I think this ties up very nicely with all the presentations. Where to from here? A new defence review or perhaps an interim plan? Any of the speakers, if you'd like to respond to that, please put on your cameras and your mic, and I will turn mine off before we go to the next question. Yes, Francois.
That is a tough question, and I'm merely going to give an opinion. It took so long to get to the defence review and then basically dump it. Personally, I don't think there's time and space and a good rationale to embark on a new defence review, but to rather distill from the current defence review what is worthwhile for moving towards the future and what should we use in order to move forward. A new defence review, in my mind, no. It might sound good, it might sound interesting, I just don't think it's practical. I doubt whether it will render any benefits more than what we have at the moment.
Moses, would you like to respond?
Yeah, just briefly, Chair. And it's a very important question that Dr. Janse van Rensburg has raised. I happen to be one of the guilty parties when it comes to the defense review, but just by way of context, the assignment of the defense review was, what is it that South Africa needs from a defense perspective, regardless of the financial constraints? So it did not, it was a specific term of reference that it should not be about budget, but about what does the country need from a defense perspective. So from that point of view, I agree with Prof. Frey that having a new defense review process will not necessarily add value. But there is a particular aspect of that defense review which says we need to arrest the decline. That decline is what I've just indicated, and that's what everybody's been talking about. That you can't allow the defense force to deteriorate, to degenerate to a point where you only have one plane, or you have an Air Force with all the planes being on the ground, nothing takes off, no ship is sailing, and so on. So I think our efforts should go towards arresting the decline. Thanks, Chair.
Sorry, I had problem taking my unmuting my mic there. So we've got another question. I think it's to any one of the contributors. Professor Frey asks from Colonel Andre de Jager. He asks, Professor Frey asks a very relevant question. Do we prepare the military for war or constructive futures? That's an interesting one. War is well defined as a political endeavor, and the military know we are responsible for warfare. Constructive futures require a better description, especially if we expect the military to be a contributor. I ask again to the panel, what is the future role of violence in the future of South Africa? Who must be ready to deal with those who violently threaten South Africa's peace and security? Today, the SANDF is constantly called whenever the security architecture of South Africa cannot deal with violence that threatens South Africa's peace and security. 5 wars in 100 years for South Africa is a stark reminder of our violent history that we have. So any comments on that? And I don't know if there's another one. Yes, there's a few more below this. I don't know how much time we've got, but perhaps if we can have short responses to that question.
I'll respond to the one about destructive and constructive futures. After the Cold War, the whole idea of these massive military clashes became embedded and transformed and type of molded, where militaries played preventative roles to help societies, to prevent aggression, to help stop brush fire wars, etc. And the only matter that I'm thinking about in that sense that I said there, if we look at the South African National Defence Force now and for the immediate future, motivations around why we should do certain things, why we should have certain kinds of equipment, what role we should play, what are we geared for, what is the preferred role of the military. Those arguments all point to the softer side, to prevent, to help societies, to promote human security, to promote economic prosperity, to help keep the seas safe, etc., etc. And that is all that I meant by we must decide what we want. On the one hand, we say, yeah, war fighting and military attack is the most dangerous one. But when we do the motivations and what we should be doing and how we want to see ourselves, it's more about constructive futures. And we type of get buffeted between the two. And it's a political decision. Where do we want to be and what do we want to do and what kind of military do we want?
Thank you for that response. And here's a question for you, Professor van der Waag. Referring to your first slide, is there an indigenous warfare component to the Eastern and Western influences on South Africa warfare?
Thank you for the question. I think it's from Professor Nordman, if I see it there. I think there certainly is. If we take a look, for example, at Boer warfare, for example, as it sort of crystallized and came into being from the early 18th century, this had very, very strong indigenous influences. And if I may, for the sake of brevity, I'll post a link perhaps to an article in the chat, that discusses that. And there are, of course, other examples as well, in terms of some of the colonial units that didn't come out from Britain, but in fact were formed locally and also had these indigenous influences. But I'll post a link here. Thank you.
Right, thank you there, Ian. And then we can go to the next question. I don't know, I think we can probably have a few more. We're running about 10 minutes over time. It is clear that from Hanno Teutenberg, it is clear that the SNDF and defence industry is out of step, not only with the present, but also the future. The Defence Review is clearly out of date and unaffordable. In terms of funding and threat analysis, it is feasible to continue attempts to provide a conventional warfare tool or should realistic alternatives be sought? So your response is there if anyone wants to, anyone of the speakers wants to jump in on that.
Chair, I think Admiral, there's a lot of sympathy with the view that conventional warfare is outdated and so on. There are so many sympathizers with that view, but unfortunately the reality is different. The requirements for our involvement in peacekeeping operations require a lot of our conventional capability, but obviously the only difference is that those have got to be supported with much more newer forms of technology, including your unmanned UAVs, for example, to get a sense of what is happening in the operational environment. So it's probably a conventional warfare plus, or a select type of more modern types of equipment for conventional warfare, but not zero conventional warfare tools approach. I hope that makes sense. Because where we have to get involved in Africa, there's a lot that requires that kind of equipment. Thank you.
Thank you, Moses. I'm going to just sort of sum up the last two questions because of not out of disrespect, but for the sake of time. It's three questions from Lerato Tsebe, and then also from Zane Cleophas. And both questions really relate to a big issue. The bigger issue is the SANDF really out of step with the future realities, not only just externally in terms of threat perspectives, but also internally in terms of things like youth unemployment. So how would we get the Defence Force, I'm addressing this to the speakers, in step with the future realities that we face?
I just want to give a very brief answer to those questions. And I want to refer to the first presentation today that has to do with to decide what futures do you want to pursue. And that will tell you a lot. If you can make that hard or those hard decisions, it's almost around wars of destiny and wars of efficiency. The one you drift towards the future, the other one you decide what are you going to get involved in, and at the collective political level, you should forge a consensus that some matters where you are required to get involved in, you can go, and then there are certain things that's not the game that we're going to play in. We're not going to play in that league. It's tough and it's difficult, but if you don't make those decisions, then you're going to drift into every future that you can think of, and you're going to try and be everything for everybody. In the meantime, you're going to be nothing for most of the time.
Thank you very much there, Francois. So I think at this point in time, I'm just going to say thank you to everyone for their questions and hand over to Johansi van Wyk to close this meeting and session, share a few thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you to our panel of speakers, and of course to Professor Heineken for her astute handling of that. If you allow me, let me just keep a short recap and make a few closing remarks after these most insightful presentations. Let me also thank the organizers and the speakers for this afternoon. Before I give a number of closing remarks, let me remind us about Dr. Morné Mostert's focus on the notion of strategic foresight and the options for alternative futures. He said that the future is surely not what it used to be. It is not an attractive future if we continue with our current thinking, and that we need to learn more about learning about the future. Looking at future changes, the future and presenting entrapment of the future created by our competitor, these are important, that we need to have new approaches to the future and to realize a multiplicity of futures. However, he said, decisions about the future are not always made in the present. So how does one make meaningful decisions? According to him, this depends on the objective you aim to achieve and the future you want. He described that as a normative future, but he made a case for a more of an exploratory future analysis, which is a truly daunting undertaking and crucial for military futures and global security due to, amongst other factors, military's histories, values, cultures, organization, budgets, and mental modules. Some of these aspects that Professor van der Waag also touched upon. Professor Mostert also said that mental models shape decisions. And it is not necessarily the truth that it does shape decisions, but it determines perceptions, action, and an understanding of the present and futures. Current military designs and decision-making, he said, are mostly counterintuitive to the future and requires a more considered and imaginative and curious intellectual approach to and in terms of the future. Ideally, a design with the future should be considered and implemented. Quoting Winston Churchill, Dr. Mostert concluded with reference to the importance of the mind and ideas, major determinants of the future. Following from Dr. Mostert has been the very insightful presentation by Professor Ian van der Waag on change and innovation in South Africa's military. giving a historical overview of what has influenced South Africa's military lethality, deployability, versatility, and agility. Directing his presentation to military's failure to change and innovate, Professor van der Waag provided the example of France during World War II. He also alluded to the strategic effect of scientific innovations such as radar and its impact on war. An insightful historical outline of changes in and the transformation of the South African military and its operational deployments followed. Returning to thinking about change in militaries, Professor van der Waag alluded to factors affecting military responsiveness, awareness of new threats, the length of conflicts, and military action. Military culture is an essential aspect of change and innovation, and this is the factor that determines it, and vice versa, he said. Military knowledge production, a matter also raised by Professor Francois Frey, is another aspect. How and what do militaries learn from their past deployments? So what drives military change and innovation? According to Professor van der Waag, military culture and strategic doctrine is one of these drivers. Second, technological change. But he also alluded to constraints to change and innovation that include external factors such as the peace and anti-military movement after World War II, and of course changes in governments since then, changes in budgetary allocations, and loss of innovation and innovators during peacetime. In conclusion, Professor van der Waag referred to the utility of looking back and indeed learn from it, and as one faces an uncertain future. This aspect of bringing the past and the future into alignment has also been raised by Dr. Kanyili. One lesson is the importance of innovation that we can learn from history, according to Professor van der Waag. He said that the generation of new ideas and new thinking is another lesson. Thirdly, he said that it is important that there should be sufficient budgetary allocations enabling innovation. And finally, he said, military leadership drive and initiate innovation. Without that, it cannot occur. Our third speaker was Francois Frey. He set the scene for military's future-orientated approach, why that is important and how it should respond. He focused on the significance of politics, political leaders, and military decision makers to face future defense dilemmas. Military failure, he said, often coincide with political failure and collapse. He cited Russia's experience in Chechnya as an example of military miscalculation after the end of the Cold War, but it gave Russia the opportunity to reorientate itself and implement its future military preparedness and operation that paved the way for its incursions into the Crimea and Syria. He explained, Francois now, that traditional threats are seemingly becoming more deprioritized, but remains an imperative. Increased complex environments challenge military futures and neglect occurs at a military's peril. And awareness of alternative military futures is obligatory, as he said, as is innovative thinking, such as considering collaboration with so-called enemies. Mediating influence in military futures requires, amongst others, sufficient budgetary allocation, situational awareness, and disruptive risk scenario planning. Technological change, according to Professor Frey, is not the only variable of military futures. Instead, he said, new ideas pertaining to war, success of war, and aspects that has been raised by other speakers about the nature of war, about the nature of violence. Emerging threats should be identified to create future pathways. In conclusion, Professor Frey reiterated the importance of public trust in the military to create credible futures. Military knowledge production scientists should be nurtured and utilized along decision-making to prevent destructive military futures. Before I give a few of my own ideas, I would just want to recap on Dr. Moses Kanyile's presentation, where he gave us a very insightful overview of the South African defense industry and its complex and disconnected relationship with government. He outlined the structure, suppliers, service provider, players, stakeholders, and consumers of this. But he said that the suppliers are dependent on demands of domestic and international customers, besides being affected and sometimes negatively affected by government's regulatory framework. The defense industry is export dependent, and it is typically interfacing with government on R&D matters, on Defence Industry Manufacturing Council, amongst others. But budgetary cuts, according to Dr. Kanyile, has severely affected the operations of the SANDF and hence also the South African defence industry. This disconnect between government and the industry is intractable and requires immediate remedial attention. State-owned defence industrial actors such as Defence and Arms Corps are in a poor financial state, debt-ridden, poorly governed, resulting in South Africa's defence technology expertise and market leadership shrinking compared to its international competitors, adding to the financial and scientific unsustainability of the South African defence industry and the country's military, operational and technical preparedness. Dr. Kanyile ended with provocative questions about the future of the South African defence industry as an uncertain future lies it. Now, I would like to conclude with the following ideas. The global pandemic and the truly amazing ability of the COVID-19 virus to mutate are just two examples of the challenges associated with rapid change and the new superlative super-uber complexity. Deep uncertainty and incremental or total disruption have taken on new dimension and meaning with major implications for the soldier, the state, the battle arena, civilian populations, the environment, and the military-industrial complex. In short, the uncertainty of the future may be the only certainty that we are known to. The idea of a fourth military future, Military 4.0, akin to the fourth industrial revolution, 4IR, is already an outdated concept as some states, as evident in their publicly available national security structures and strategies, are already considering and adapting to a fifth and even a sixth military future, Military 5.0 and 6, as the post-IR world unfolds. Even this notion is already aging. Future military engagement and battles will occur across a multiplicity of dimensions, most notably, for example, the physical environment, space, underground, cyberspace, the metasphere, biological, sonic, and in the realm of artificial intelligence. Military futures, yes, plural, futures are multidimensional and will occur across more than the conventional 4 dimensions or 4D that are depth, width, height, and time. Beside these, at least 8 more dimensions are increasingly recognized. Consciousness, the human mind that have been referred to, energy, virtuality, immersion, simulation, effect, affect, so-called space-time, and infinity. To this, I would add a new dimension, a post-future dimension. Thus, we have effectively reached 14D, the 14th dimension. Military Futures 14.0 is thus already here. What does it mean? Multidimensionality involves mega complexity, or then super uber complexity, and deeper uncertainty requiring more material and immaterial resources. The most unpredictable but the most valuable resource remains the human mind, an aspect that is increasingly drawing attention, as was evident during the recent Stockholm International Security Conference and the recent conference of the Hague Programme on Cyber Norms. The soldier, the theatre, and the enemy are all adapting and changing, and will even more. This sounds like esoteric abracadabra and mumbo-jumbo or even science fiction, but certain facts remain. Globalization has not eroded state sovereignty. Globalization has entrenched state sovereignty and states' ontological insecurity even more, as for example, state-led cyber warfare shows. Fact, territorial, state, sovereignty has been enhanced by state awareness and response to the 14th dimension, or 14D, that I've mentioned. Another fact, there will be no more faraway wars. All wars will become local wars due to the effect of their global disruptive nature. Fact, our thinking of the future and even the dimension of a post-future must change. But, and there's always a but, especially on the battlefield, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Apocalyptic and doomsday military futures and scenarios remind us that primitive warfare in the real sense of the word should not be ignored. Basic survival depends on water, clean air, food and shelter, all of it which are currently under threat. In other words, Abraham Maslow 101 must meet 14D, military future planning. Traditional and conventional militaries, be it state, non-state, and their doctrines are adapting in innovative ways. As an M23 soldier with a cell phone in a faraway jungle and a teen behind a screen present new battle frontiers. High-tech military should not forget about the impact of low-tech and no-tech. Thus, asymmetric warfare and its mutations should not be ignored. So what is the future of influencing military futures? Deep uncertainty, rapid and incremental disruption and threats will, like the coronavirus, continue to mutate. The military, in my view, should always err on the side of doomsday and apocalyptic futures. Worst case scenario 14.0 should drive planning, preparation, deployment, operations, withdrawal, victory, and even losing a war and restoring resilience afterwards. A futures arms of service or a futures command could amplify these aspects. Discipline, precision, information and automation, capacity, posture, agility, and combat readiness are paramount and requires astute military leadership and decision making. Old school, you may say, but it has prepared militaries through the ages and prevented and won many a war. In conclusion, military futures typically involve and engage an unknown enemy. They may be shadows of state pathology or ideas whose time has come. We must always remember that the future is already present. South Africa must wake up to the fact that the present deteriorated state of the South African military is a national security threat and will remain so in future if left unattended. In the paraphrased word of American statesman Benjamin Franklin, failing to prepare is preparing to fail. South Africa is currently preparing to dismally fail in future. Thank you very much for your attention.
Professor van Wyk, thank you so much for your very concise and insightful comments encapsulating today's conversation. It is really much appreciated. And those of you who've been in that position of having to give a summary know how difficult job this is, and to do it in a way that, you know, that really explains and summarizes everything so excellently. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much. It leaves me with a nice job at the end, just to briefly thank everybody for joining us, for the Institute for Futures research, for partnering with SIGLA in this particular event, to the speakers for really providing us much food for thought, as well as the audience for your participation and your very, very difficult and insightful questions. It is much appreciated. For those of you that I will not, that we will not see soon, we hope that you have a very festive season, and keep healthy and keep safe. And thank you for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.
Good morning. Thanks, Ian.
Thank you, Francois. Thank you, Ian.
Thank you,
Thanks,
everyone.
continued. Thank you.
Well done.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.